can count on.
We are one people with one home and one great flag.
President Trump's Reno speech was mostly geared toward our veterans, but he also touched on the social divide in our country. The presidential visit tops Channel 2 News at 5:30, and today's visit to the American Legion National Convention comes just really one day after his speech in Phoenix sparked some violent protests last night. Good evening, I'm Landon Miller.
I'm Kristen Remington. Thank you for keeping it here. Very different speech today. We have team coverage of the president's visit. Ryan Kennedy and Ariana Bennett are live near the convention center where the president spoke, with a look at where supporters and protesters of the president gathered.
Yeah, but we're going to begin with Paul Nelson, who is back in the studio with more. Paul?
Yeah, Kristen and Landon, the president talked a lot about taking care of our veterans and our active military members, but he also talked about some of the violence and protests we've seen lately. He didn't specifically touch on last night's incident in Phoenix or the violence in Charlottesville 11 days ago, but he did say it's time for unity in our country.
We are not defined by the color of our skin, the figure on our paycheck, or the party of our politics. We are defined by our shared humanity. But to fulfill our patriotic...
The president says it is, quote, time to heal the wounds that divide us during today's speech at the Reno Sparks Convention Center, talking about some of the hostility here in the U.S. He also touched on the economy, infrastructure, education, and crime. But most of his words dealt with veterans issues. He's already signed 5 VA-related bills into law, including one right here in Reno today. He says his foreign policy is based on what will keep Americans safe, and he's vowing to increase defense spending for things like high-tech weapons.
We will give our men and women in uniform the tools they need and the trust they have earned to fight and to win.
The American Legion is a nonpartisan organization, and not everyone on hand is a Trump supporter, including some of the people we talked to. But everyone seemed to like his overall message and hope he delivers on promises to veterans and the military. If you want to see the president's entire speech, head to our website, KTVN.com. Covering the presidential visit live in the studio, Paul Nelson, Channel 2 News.
Okay, Paul, thank you. And today's presidential visit attracted a big crowd of protesters. And after some clashes between police and protesters at last night's presidential rally in Phoenix, our local police were on high alert.
They certainly were. We'll head out to Ariana Bennett first with more on how our local forces handled everything. And it seemed beautifully handled, Ari.
Yeah, Kristen, it absolutely was. It was a remarkably peaceful protest. There were a lot of people out here, but there were no arrests, no injuries, really no issues at all, just a little bit of heckling between the two sides. And following the event, the police chief just wants to say thank you.
I specifically want to thank all of our citizens of Reno, the Reno area, for exercising their First Amendment rights and doing so in a respectful manner.
Now, it's really no easy task corralling 1,000 passionate protesters down a city street, but Chief Soto says thankfully they had several weeks to make a plan. Now, they had roughly 100 officers staffing the presidential visit inside and outside of the facility, as well as plainclothes officers throughout. He says that will mean a lot of overtime pay, but he won't know the full totals until next week. And in the end, he says he's very happy with the planning and the execution.
And it turned out exactly as we had planned for it to turn out.
Now, part of that plan involved using city trucks to make physical barricades in the intersection here at Virginia and Peckham. Chief Soto says that was a particular concern. He really just didn't want any vehicles to be able to drive into the crowd of protesters. So some very good planning there, and obviously everything went the way it was supposed to. But it wasn't just protesters out here. There were also a fair number of supporters. So we have Ryan Kennedy standing by now with more on how they kept it peaceful between the two sides. Ryan?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ari. It's important to note that for both the supporters of the president and also protesters who are here, they didn't have to stand on different sides during their demonstrations, although many of them chose to. Now, here's how it worked. Here at this intersection, the streets were closed off to traffic. However, there were barricades right here in the intersection that kind of closed off two separate areas. Now, you had the protesters who were standing over here on this side and over here on the other side. Well, that's where the supporters of Donald Trump were. And many people many of those supporters who we talked to said that they were proud of how peaceful each organization behaved.
Here in Reno, you see us across the street from each other, and you have people coming over and shaking each other's hands and being friendly, because some of them are going to understand that we're not here for hate.
What this group was for President Trump. There was some shouting from both sides and signs that took jabs at one another, but overall the barriers that were set up and the police presence helped to keep this event in check. Today's president supporters aren't sure if nationwide protests will continue, but they sure do hope it can come to an end.
President, can I make a change? No. The activists are going to have to make a change and accept defeat.
Now, the crowd of President Trump supporters wasn't that large over here near the Reno Sparks Convention Center. There were maybe a couple dozen people at that, but over there was a different story over there at the airport where another group of supporters gathered there to greet the president here to Reno. Covering the story live, Ryan Kennedy, Channel 2 News.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Ryan. There were about 50 supporters who got to greet the president at the Reno Tahoe International Airport today, including Ella Bowles, who turns 2 years old next month. And as you can see, President Trump picked her up from the crowd and gave her a quick kiss. She was crying a little bit there. And you know, it wasn't only a kiss, though. He really gave this family a memory that they will never forget.
She was really scared of getting picked up by him. She was crying.
She was crying?
Yeah, she was kind of mortified that her mom handed her off to a stranger.
She's a good sport, though. Still, despite Ella crying, it made for a couple of really, really incredible photos there with the president. And the family says that they'll keep these photos for quite some time. It'll be a good story for Ella when she's a little bit older, for sure. And if you're wondering, the Bowles family was invited by a family friend to attend. That family friend works for the Secret Service.